Long before the Republic, before the Sith, before the great wars that reshaped the galaxy, the Jedi were something different. They were not yet warriors, nor were they enforcers of galactic law. They were seekers, monks who followed the will of the Force, wandering the stars in search of understanding. They built no great temples, waged no battles, and swore allegiance to no government. Their purpose was enlightenment, their weapon was knowledge, and their only code was balance. But balance is fragile and understanding is never unanimous. Even in these early days there were disagreements. What was the Force's true nature? Was it a tool to be wielded or a current to be followed? Was power something to be feared or embraced? These questions would shape the fate of the Jedi and set the course for the wars to come. The Jedi were born from a people known as the Dai Bendu, an ancient order of mystics who meditated upon the will of the Force in solitude. Over centuries, their teachings evolved, spreading across the galaxy and drawing in new disciples from many worlds. The order was not unified in those days. Different enclaves formed their own traditions, interpreting the Force in ways that suited their beliefs. Some saw it as a path to transcendence, others as a means to bring harmony to the galaxy. And among them, some began to see something else, the potential for control. The first great schism came when a faction of Jedi sought to use the Force, not simply to understand the universe, but to shape it. These Jedi did not see themselves as servants of the Force, but as its masters, bending its energy to their will. They discovered how to channel its power into destruction, manipulating the very fabric of life itself. Their knowledge grew, but so did their ambition. It was the Jedi's greatest fear realized, light turning against itself. For the first time, the Order fractured. The Jedi who sought dominion over the Force were cast out, banished from their sacred worlds. This was not just a rejection of their methods, it was a warning. The Force was not meant to be controlled, and those who tried would bring only suffering. But the exiles did not disappear. Instead, they gathered in the shadows, their power growing unchecked, their hatred deepening. This schism marked the beginning of a cycle that would repeat throughout history. Jedi against Jedi, ideals against ambition, the battle between those who sought to follow the Force and those who sought to wield it. What the Order failed to realize was that by casting out their brethren, they had not destroyed them. They had created something else entirely. In time, these exiled Jedi would find a new home on a distant world. There they would encounter a civilization unlike any other, warriors steeped in the dark side, beings who had already embraced what the Jedi had rejected: the Sith. And from this meeting, the Jedi's greatest enemy was born. But long before the rise of the Sith, long before the wars that would bring the Republic to the brink of ruin, the Jedi had to face their own internal struggles. The schism was not a single event, nor was it the last. Disagreements over the nature of the Force would continue to fracture the Order. There would be those who believed the Jedi should serve as warriors, protectors of civilization. Others would argue that they should remain monks, untouched by the conflicts of the galaxy. Some believed the dark side could be studied without corruption. Others saw even knowledge of it as a dangerous temptation. These arguments would define the Jedi's destiny. The Order's future would be determined not by an external enemy, but by the choices they made within. And so, the seeds of war were sown not by the Sith, not by the Republic, but by the Jedi themselves. Did the Jedi ever truly stand as one? Or was their unity always an illusion, waiting to be shattered? The battles to come, the wars that would tear the galaxy apart, would not begin on the field of battle. They began here, in the halls of meditation, in the whispered debates of scholars, in the unshakable certainty of those who believed they alone understood the Force. The Jedi had spent centuries seeking balance, but in doing so, they had set themselves upon a path toward conflict. And so the question remains, were the Jedi ever truly keepers of peace, or were they always warriors of destiny? For centuries, the Jedi Order sought harmony within itself, yet peace was never absolute. Beneath the surface of their unity, ideological fractures deepened, growing into something far more dangerous than simple disagreements. It was not the Sith who first challenged the Jedi, it was their own. The 100-Year Darkness was not a battle between light and dark, but a conflict among those who once called themselves brothers. It was the first true Jedi War, and it would change the galaxy forever. At its heart, the war was driven by a single question. What was the true nature of the Force? The Jedi had long believed that balance came through discipline and restraint, that power was to be wielded with caution and selflessness. But not all agreed. Some among their ranks saw the Force as limitless, an energy to be shaped and bent to the will of those strong enough to command it. These Jedi believed knowledge should never be restricted. That mastery of the Force meant embracing all its aspects, even those the Order had long feared. They were not warriors, not at first. They were scholars, seekers of hidden truths, but knowledge has a way of reshaping its wielder. As they delved deeper into the Force's mysteries, they uncovered something ancient, forgotten techniques that allowed them to manipulate life itself. Their pursuit of power led them to a discovery the Jedi would never forgive: the art of alchemy. Through the dark side, they reshaped the natural world. Flesh and bone became weapons. Creatures of unimaginable terror were forged in hidden laboratories. The Jedi had always believed the Force flowed through all living things, binding them together in harmony. These heretics twisted that connection, warping life into something unrecognizable. They did not seek to understand the Force. They sought to command it. When the Jedi Council learned of these experiments, they acted swiftly. What had once been philosophical debates became an ultimatum: renounce these unnatural practices, or be cast out. But those who had walked this path could not turn back. To them, the Jedi were not protectors of peace, but tyrants, denying them the knowledge that could make them greater. And so, the war began. It was unlike any battle the Jedi had faced before. These fallen warriors, now branded as heretics, did not fight with simple lightsabers or battle meditation. They fought with monstrosities of their own making, beasts infused with the dark side, warriors whose very bodies had been reforged through Sith alchemy. They wielded powers the Jedi had never seen, reshaping the battlefield with unnatural strength and fury. For 100 years, the war raged across the stars. Entire worlds were scarred by the conflict. The Jedi, despite their numbers and discipline, struggled against an enemy that defied the natural order. These dark Jedi did not fight for conquest or politics. They fought for evolution, for the belief that through power they could transcend the limitations imposed by the Jedi Code. And for a time, it seemed they might succeed. But the dark side is a double-edged blade. As their power grew, so did their hunger for dominance. They turned against one another, each seeking to prove themselves the strongest. They did not fight as one, but as individuals, their ambition making them vulnerable. The Jedi, bound by their unity, struck back. One by one, the heretics fell, their monstrous creations destroyed, their strongholds burned to ruin. The war ended, but its consequences had only begun. The Jedi had won, but what had they truly achieved? The defeated were not slain. Instead, they were cast out, exiled beyond the known stars, sent to wander the void. The Jedi believed they had purged the corruption from their ranks, that by removing the heretics, they had restored balance. But in doing so, they had sealed their own fate. These outcasts drifted to the edges of the galaxy, searching for a new home. And they found it. On a distant world, forgotten by time, they encountered a species steeped in the dark side, warriors who had embraced the very power the Jedi had rejected. The Sith. What the Jedi had cast away did not wither and die. It grew. It evolved. These fallen Jedi, no longer bound by the laws of the Order, did what they had always sought to do. They mastered the dark side, shaping it into something the Jedi had never imagined. They were no longer outcasts. They had become something greater. And so, the Sith were born. The 100-year darkness was not just a war. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. In their fear, the Jedi had believed they could contain the darkness, that exile was a form of victory. But they had done the very thing they sought to prevent. They had given their enemies time. They had given them purpose. And in the shadows, the Sith prepared. For the first time, the Jedi had created something they could not control. And the war they thought they had won was only the beginning. The Sith had been cast out, exiled beyond the reaches of the Republic, but they had not been destroyed. For generations, the Jedi believed they had won, that the dark side had been purged from the galaxy. It was an illusion. The Sith had not perished. They had evolved. The Republic, blind in its security, was unprepared when the Sith returned, not as scattered remnants, but as an empire reborn in fire and vengeance. The first war between the Jedi and the Sith was unlike any conflict the galaxy had known. It was not a battle of conquest, but a war of survival, a clash of philosophies that had been brewing since the first great schisms within the Jedi Order. The Sith, led by their Dark Lords, had spent centuries preparing for this moment. Their armies were vast, their knowledge of the Force twisted into devastating weapons. They had not only survived in exile, they had grown stronger, fueled by the teachings of their ancestors, by the hatred they had nurtured in the shadows. The Republic was caught off guard, believing itself unassailable beneath the Jedi's protection. But the Jedi were not warriors by nature. They were guardians, scholars, seekers of wisdom. When war came, they were forced to become something they were never meant to be. They wielded their sabers on the battlefield, leading Republic forces against an enemy that fought without restraint. The Sith did not seek peace. They sought dominance. They reveled in the chaos of war, seeing every battle as an opportunity to crush weakness and forge strength. Worlds burned as the conflict spread across the galaxy. Entire civilizations were caught between the warring factions, torn apart by the raw power of the Force unleashed on an unprecedented scale. The Sith wielded sorcery and brute strength, while the Jedi fought with discipline and unity. And yet, despite their wisdom, the Jedi could not predict the true nature of the Sith's strategy. The Sith did not fight to win through military conquest alone. Their war was one of corruption, deception, and slow decay. They did not need to defeat the Jedi in a single decisive moment. They needed only to break them over time. The Jedi Order had long adhered to strict codes, rules designed to keep them from the temptations of power. They had built an institution meant to withstand corruption, but the Sith understood a truth the Jedi refused to see. Order and discipline could be their own kind of weakness. The Jedi's commitment to peace made them hesitant to take decisive action. Their belief in balance blinded them to the extremes their enemies were willing to embrace. The Sith, unburdened by such constraints, exploited this hesitation at every turn. There were those among the Jedi who saw this flaw and questioned the Order's methods. Some believed that to defeat the Sith The Jedi must be willing to embrace more than just the light. Others feared that the war itself was proof that the Jedi had already lost their way. They had once served the Force, but now they served the Republic, waging a war that threatened to consume their very purpose. Every battle hardened them. Every victory came at a cost. And as the war dragged on, some Jedi began to wonder, were they fighting the Sith, or were they becoming them? The Sith, for all their cruelty, understood something the Jedi did not. War was change. Victory was not about righteousness, but about adaptation. The Jedi clung to tradition, to the ways of the past, believing that if they held true to their teachings, they would prevail. The Sith saw weakness in this stagnation. They embraced the war, using it to test their apprentices, to cull the weak, to refine their understanding of power. Every loss made them stronger. Every defeat was merely a lesson. As the conflict reached its peak, both sides pushed the limits of what the Force could achieve. The Jedi sought greater mastery, searching for ways to counteract the Sith's relentless aggression. The Sith delved deeper into the dark side, sacrificing morality for power, reshaping themselves into weapons of destruction. It was a war fought not only in the physical realm, but in the very essence of the Force itself. But war is never without consequence. Even as the Jedi stood against the Sith, they were not unscathed. Their victories came with scars, not just on the battlefield, but within their own hearts. The Republic they fought to protect had changed, molded by war into something different, something willing to compromise its ideals for the sake of survival. The Jedi were no longer just peacekeepers. They had become warriors, and that change could not be undone. The Sith, too, paid a price for their ambition. For all their victories, they were plagued by betrayal, by the very nature of their philosophy. Strength ruled among them, and so they fought not only the Jedi but each other. Alliances were temporary. Loyalty was a lie. Every Sith sought to claim power, to rise above their rivals, and in doing so, they sowed the seeds of their own downfall. This war would not be the last. The Jedi and Sith had clashed before, and they would clash again. But this was the moment the Republic truly learned fear. The Jedi had always spoken of the dark side, had always warned of its dangers. Now the galaxy had seen it firsthand. They had witnessed what the Sith were capable of, the destruction they could unleash. And though the Jedi would claim victory, it was a fragile one. The war had not ended. It had only changed form. The Sith had been defeated before, and they would be defeated again. But they had also survived before, and they would survive again. The cycle had begun, and now it would never truly end. For centuries, the Sith had existed in isolation, ruling over their hidden empire in the far reaches of the galaxy. They had been forgotten by the Republic, erased from the records of the Jedi Order. But darkness does not remain in exile forever. When the Sith finally emerged, it was not as scattered warlords or exiled remnants. It was as a conquering force, an empire vast and ancient, ready to strike at the heart of the galaxy. The great Hyperspace War would not be a battle for territory. It would be a war of annihilation. At the heart of this offensive stood one man, Naga Sadow, a Sith sorcerer, a master of manipulation, a visionary who saw not only conquest, but transformation. The Sith had grown complacent in their seclusion, ruling over their dominion with unchallenged authority. But Sadow was different. He did not see the Sith as rulers of the forgotten corners of the galaxy. He saw them as its rightful overlords. The Republic had flourished in their absence, had grown vast and arrogant, unaware that a storm was gathering beyond the stars. But even among the Sith, ambition was a dangerous thing. Sado had not risen to power through honor or tradition. He had seized it, eliminating his rivals, feeding their paranoia, turning the Sith against themselves. The Sith Empire was not a unified machine of war. It was an empire of betrayal, where strength was measured in deception as much as power. Sado understood this. He did not wait for the Sith to agree on their course of action. He forced their hand. With the stroke of a blade, he ensured that he alone would lead the Sith into war. The Republic did not see the attack coming. For generations, the Jedi had spoken of the dark side, but few still believed in the existence of the Sith as an organized force. The hyperspace lanes had long been the domain of explorers, traders, and outlaws. But when the Sith arrived, they did not come to trade. They came to conquer. They struck with precision, emerging from the void with a fleet unlike anything the Republic had faced before. Sith warriors, alchemically enhanced, wielding weapons infused with dark energy, descended upon unsuspecting worlds. The Republic reeled. Their military, designed for defense, was ill-equipped to counter such an overwhelming force. The Jedi, scattered and unprepared, were forced into battle without strategy or coordination. And yet, the Sith were not invincible. Their own arrogance, their belief in their supremacy, would be their undoing. Sado had relied on deception to gain power, and in the end, it would be deception that would cost him everything. Amidst the Republic's desperation, a hero emerged, Empress Teta. A leader of unwavering will, she refused to let the Sith consume the galaxy without a fight. While others hesitated, she acted. She gathered fleets, consolidated forces, and led an uncompromising counter-offensive. But war has no victors, only those who survive. In her pursuit of victory, Teta unleashed devastation that rivaled even the horrors of the Sith. Worlds burned. Entire star systems were caught in the crossfire. The Jedi, forced to embrace the warrior's path once more, fought not just for the Republic's survival, but for their own. Naga Sado, once a master of deception, now found himself ensnared in his own lies. He had promised his followers victory, but the war was turning against him. He had assumed the Republic would fall as easily as his Sith rivals, but he had underestimated the power of desperation. The Republic was not a single empire to be conquered. It was an unbreakable idea. The Jedi were not warriors, but they would not stand aside and let darkness consume the galaxy. The war was no longer a conquest, it was a reckoning. And so Sado did what Sith had done for generations. He betrayed his own. His forces, already weary from the war, turned on one another. His deception had brought him to power, and now it would be his downfall. The Sith could conquer many things, but they could never conquer themselves. Their hunger for dominance ensured that they were always at war, even when faced with extinction. The Republic, wounded but standing, struck back. The Sith, divided and leaderless, could not withstand the full might of the Jedi and their allies. The Great Hyperspace War ended not with the Sith triumphant, but with their empire in flames. Sado, once the architect of their ascension, was reduced to a fugitive, fleeing into the darkness from which he had emerged. The Sith had believed themselves to be gods, but in the end, they were mortals, bound by the same failures that had doomed them before. But war does not simply end. Its echoes ripple across time. The Jedi had won, but at what cost? The Republic had survived, but it had been forever changed. The Sith had been driven back into the shadows, but they were not gone. Sado had been defeated, but he had planted a seed. The Sith had learned from this war. They had seen that brute force alone could not destroy the Republic, that the Jedi could not be overwhelmed by strength alone, They would adapt, they would wait, and they would return. The Jedi believed they had sealed away the darkness, but darkness does not fade, it waits. The war was over, but the Sith's true conquest had only just begun. The war was over, but the conflict was far from finished. The Sith had been broken, their empire shattered, their fleets scattered across the void. The Republic rejoiced, believing the darkness had been vanquished. But the Jedi knew better. Victory was not merely a matter of conquest, it was survival. The Sith had not simply been defeated, they had been wounded, and wounded enemies, left unchecked, could return stronger than before. The Jedi, bound by their duty as guardians of peace, faced a grim realization. If the Sith were to be truly eradicated, they would have to hunt them to the very edges of the galaxy. Thus began the Great Sith Purge, a campaign unlike anything the Jedi had ever undertaken. This was not a battle between armies. It was a war of shadows, fought in secret, driven by fear. The Sith who had survived the Hyperspace War had fled into the unknown, scattering like embers cast from a dying fire. Some disappeared into deep space, hiding in forgotten star systems. Others took new identities, burying themselves in the fringes of civilization, waiting for their moment to return. The Jedi, relentless in their pursuit, were not content to let the Sith simply fade into legend. But here lay the paradox. The Jedi Order had always prided itself on its role as defenders, not executioners. They did not seek revenge. They did not kill out of hatred. Yet the Sith represented something more than just an enemy. They were an existential threat, one that could never be allowed to rise again. How could the Jedi, sworn to preserve life, justify hunting down those who had already been defeated? This was the moral wound that would linger long after the last Sith Lord had fallen. To the Republic, the Purge was necessary. The Sith had brought the galaxy to the brink of ruin, and the Republic's survival depended on ensuring they never returned. But war breeds destruction on both sides. Some Jedi, believing their mission to be righteous, became something unrecognizable. They did not see themselves as peacekeepers. They saw themselves as hunters. There were those who pursued the Sith not out of duty, but out of vengeance, convinced that only through eradication could balance be restored. In their pursuit of darkness, some found themselves standing too close to the abyss. The Sith, ever cunning, understood this. They knew that fear was a weapon as powerful as any blade. They whispered to those Jedi who hunted them, planting doubt in their minds, forcing them to question the very nature of their mission. "Are we so different?" the Sith would ask. "Do you not see the hypocrisy? You preach peace, and yet you bring war. You speak of justice, yet you seek extermination." And in some cases, the Sith did not have to kill their Jedi pursuers. Doubt alone was enough to break them. The survivors of the Sith Empire learned from their downfall. They saw how brute force had failed them. Nagasado's grand vision had crumbled beneath its own arrogance, proving that overwhelming strength alone could not defeat the Jedi. The Sith who remained understood that war would no longer be waged on battlefields. It would be fought in whispers, in shadows, in deception. The rule of the strong had led them to ruin, and so they adapted. They learned patience. Many of the surviving Sith became wanderers, taking on new identities, waiting for a time when the Republic and the Jedi would grow complacent. Others sought refuge in ancient ruins, studying the forgotten teachings of Sith Lords long past. Holocrons, texts, relics, anything that could preserve their knowledge for the future. They no longer sought conquest in the traditional sense. They sought survival, biding their time until the galaxy had forgotten them. But time did not heal all wounds. The Jedi Purge did not bring peace, it left scars. The Order had succeeded in destroying the Sith's empire, but in doing so, they had changed. The line between Guardian and Warrior had blurred, and the war had forced the Jedi to embrace a brutality they once abhorred. And for the Republic, the threat of the Sith became a ghost story, something to be feared but never fully understood. The Sith had lost the war, but they had gained something just as valuable: myth. In the years that followed, they would not simply be remembered as an enemy defeated, but as something far worse, an enemy lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The Jedi had sought to erase the Sith from history, but in doing so, they had made them legends, and legends once whispered never truly die. The Purge had nearly wiped out the Sith, but it had also set the stage for their return. The Jedi had shown them what did not work, what had led to their downfall, and the Sith who remained, the ones who had survived through cunning rather than strength, understood that the path forward would not be through war, but through secrecy. They would not strike from the front, they would strike from within. The Great Sith Purge was not the end of the Sith. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. The Jedi had once believed the Sith were extinct, erased from history by the Great Purge. They had been wrong. From the ashes of the old empire, new Sith rose, not as a singular force, but as warlords, cult leaders, and dark prophets, each claiming dominion over the dark side. What had once been a hidden enemy lurking in the shadows now erupted into a chaos unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. This was not a war between two great powers. It was 1,000 wars, a ceaseless wave of destruction that battered the Republic for generations. The Jedi, once the protectors of peace, became something else entirely, warriors locked in an endless cycle of conflict. The new Sith Wars were not a single battle, nor a single campaign. They were a slow, grinding collapse that threatened to undo the Republic itself. Where once the Sith had operated in secrecy, they now emerged in numbers, driven by ambition and vengeance. Sith lords carved out their own fiefdoms, turning entire sectors into battlegrounds. Republic worlds, once secure under Jedi protection, burned under the onslaught of war. Some Jedi saw their Order's purpose unraveling before them. Others, desperate to restore peace, became increasingly brutal, mirroring the enemy they had sworn to defeat. There was no longer a single Sith leader orchestrating these conflicts. Instead, the Sith became fractured warlords, each waging their own campaigns, each seeking to claim ultimate power. And yet, despite their internal rivalries, they achieved something their predecessors had not: a war without end. A conflict so relentless that the Republic itself began to falter. The Jedi, stretched thin across the galaxy, no longer had the luxury of patience. The balance they had once sworn to protect had been shattered. The very nature of the Jedi Order began to change. They had once been philosophers and diplomats, seeking harmony in the Force. But war demanded something else. They became soldiers, generals leading armies, their robes replaced by armor, their temples transformed into war rooms. The teachings of the Jedi Code, serenity, detachment, the rejection of fear, began to feel hollow in the face of the Sith's unrelenting advance. For some, the line between Jedi and warrior blurred beyond recognition. Could one remain a Jedi while waging an endless war? Could peace be achieved through violence? The Republic, once the beacon of stability, teetered on the brink of collapse. Faith in the Jedi wavered. Once revered as protectors, they now seemed like another faction in an eternal struggle. Politicians questioned their effectiveness. Entire worlds, weary of war, abandoned the Republic altogether, choosing neutrality or aligning themselves with Sith warlords who promised protection in exchange for loyalty. The corruption within the Republic deepened as some leaders saw opportunity in chaos. For the Jedi, this was the deepest wound of all, not the battles lost, but the loss of trust. What had they become? Had the Order strayed too far from its purpose? The High Council, once certain in its wisdom, began to fracture. Some believed that only through absolute control could the Sith be defeated. Others argued that war itself was corrupting the Jedi, pulling them toward darkness, and still, the fighting continued. The Sith, for all their strength, were not invincible. Their greatest weakness had always been their own nature. Infighting plagued them. Lords betrayed apprentices. Apprentices overthrew masters. The same ambition that fueled them also ensured they could never truly unite. This was the Jedi's only advantage, the certainty that in time, the Sith would consume themselves. But time was running out. The Republic was crumbling, and with each battle fought, the Jedi lost a piece of themselves. For a moment it seemed as though the Sith had already won, not through conquest, but through attrition. The Jedi Order was exhausted, diminished. The Republic fractured. Even if the Sith were defeated, what would remain? And then, a darkness began to rise within the chaos. One that would bring an end to this war not through numbers, but through cunning. A single Sith, watching from the shadows, saw the flaws in both Jedi and Sith alike. He did not see the chaos of the war as a path to victory. He saw it as a mistake. The Sith had always lost because they had been reckless, undisciplined. They had sought power in the moment, rather than in the future. He knew that for the Sith to truly win, they could not continue as warlords or conquerors. They would have to become something far more patient. This Sith's name was Darth Bane, and he would reshape the Sith Order in ways no one had before. The new Sith Wars had dragged on for a millennium, leaving the galaxy in a near-permanent state of ruin. The Republic was fractured, the Jedi were exhausted, and the Sith had become an unrelenting force of destruction. But this war was not one of conquest. It had devolved into something far worse. There were no victors, only endless bloodshed. And so both the Jedi and the Sith, desperate to bring an end to this war, turned their focus to a single planet, Ruusan. Ruusan was not an important world in any traditional sense. It was not a core system or a stronghold of trade and influence. But for both the Sith Brotherhood and the Jedi Army of Light, it became a battlefield that would determine the fate of the galaxy. Lord Khan, leader of the Sith Brotherhood, believed that absolute victory could be achieved through a final confrontation. His rival, Jedi General Lord Hoth, shared the same belief, that by luring the Sith into one last battle, the war could end. What neither side realized was that they were not forging a path to victory. They were walking toward mutual annihilation. The Ruusan campaign was unlike any conflict before it. This was not a war fought over politics or ideology. It was fought out of desperation. The Jedi, once peacekeepers, had become warriors without an alternative. The Sith, driven by ambition, had become their own worst enemy. Thousands of Force users clashed on the war-torn surface of Ruusan, their battles scarring the planet itself. What had once been a verdant world became a graveyard. But neither the Jedi nor the Sith were willing to retreat. Lord Hoth led the Jedi with a determination that bordered on recklessness. He believed in the righteousness of their cause, but he had also grown hardened by war. The Jedi had been fighting for so long that peace seemed like a distant dream. Victory was the only way forward, no matter the cost. Under his command, the Jedi launched relentless assaults, forcing the Sith back into defensive positions. It seemed for a time that the Republic's forces would prevail. But Lord Khan had no intention of surrendering. The Sith Brotherhood had always been a chaotic, fragile alliance of warlords, bound together only by their mutual hatred of the Jedi. Unlike the Sith of old, who had embraced cunning and secrecy, Khan's Brotherhood was driven by sheer force of numbers. He believed in strength through unity, a philosophy that ignored the very nature of the dark side. The Sith were not meant to be equals. They were meant to struggle, to devour each other, to rise through treachery and domination. And because Khan rejected this truth, his Brotherhood was doomed from the start. As the battle raged, Khan, blinded by desperation, made a decision that would alter the course of history. He turned to an ancient and forbidden technique, the thought bomb. This was no ordinary weapon. It was a creation of the dark side itself, a manifestation of hatred and destruction. By harnessing the collective power of his Sith Lords, Khan sought to unleash a wave of devastation so great that it would wipe out the Jedi in a single moment. He did not see the flaw in his plan, or perhaps he did and chose to ignore it. The thought bomb did not discriminate between Jedi and Sith. It consumed all life caught in its grasp. When it detonated, it tore through the battlefield, annihilating those nearest to it and trapping their spirits in eternal torment. Lord Hoth and his Jedi were vaporized. The Sith who had stood alongside Khan suffered the same fate. In one moment of arrogance, the Sith Brotherhood ceased to exist. But not all Sith were lost. One survived. One had foreseen the weakness of Khan's Brotherhood, the futility of massed armies and reckless war. Darth Bane had watched from the shadows, knowing that this would be the end of the old Sith. He did not seek to stop Khan's madness. Instead, he allowed it to unfold, ensuring that the weak would be culled, that only the strong would endure. When the dust settled, he was the last Sith Lord standing. For the Republic and the Jedi, Ruusan was seen as a victory. The Sith were gone, their armies broken. The Republic had its peace, and the Jedi had fulfilled their purpose. But it was a hollow victory. The cost had been immense, and the Jedi were left scarred, their ranks decimated. More than that, they had been deceived. They believed the Sith were truly extinct, but they had only been reborn, not in numbers, but in secrecy. Darth Bane understood what Khan had failed to grasp. The Sith had always lost because they were too many. They had betrayed each other, fought against each other, weakened themselves through arrogance and impatience. Bane saw the truth. The Sith could not survive as an army. They could only survive as a singular, disciplined force, hidden, patient, waiting for the right moment to strike. And so, from the ashes of Ruusan, the Sith were remade. The rule of two was born. One master to hold the power, one apprentice to crave it. No more infighting, no more senseless wars. Only a singular goal, to destroy the Jedi, not through open battle, but through cunning, through manipulation, through the long game. Ruusan had ended the Jedi-Sith War, but it had not ended the war between light and dark. It had only shifted the battlefield. And as the Republic celebrated its triumph, as the Jedi turned their focus toward rebuilding, Bane disappeared into the shadows, waiting, watching, preparing for the day when the Sith would rise again, not as conquerors, but as architects of the Jedi's downfall. The Sith Brotherhood had perished on Ruusan, consumed by its own arrogance. The thought bomb had obliterated Jedi and Sith alike, leaving nothing but ghosts to haunt the scorched battlefield. To the Republic, it was the end of an era. The Jedi stood victorious, believing the Sith had been wiped from existence. But they had been deceived. In the ashes of war, in the silence that followed ruin, a single Sith Lord remained. and from his survival, a new Sith order was born, one that would not repeat the mistakes of the past. Darth Bane had never fought for Lord Khan's brotherhood. He had observed, he had studied, he had seen the Sith falter, not because of weakness in the Force, but because of weakness in philosophy. Khan's brotherhood had been a distortion of the Sith's true nature, a gathering of equals, where infighting and treachery weakened the collective. They had been numerous, but that had only made them fragile. They had wielded great power, but without purpose, and so they had destroyed themselves. Bane did not mourn their loss. He had foreseen it. He had orchestrated it. From the beginning, he had understood that the Sith could never thrive as an army. True power was not found in numbers, but in control. It was not chaos that would bring the Sith victory, but discipline. The Sith had failed for millennia because they had not understood this. They had sought strength, but they had been consumed by their own greed. Bane's vision was different. The Sith would not be a legion. They would be a dynasty, one master, one apprentice. No more infighting, no more weakness. The rule of two was not simply a doctrine, it was a necessity. One Sith to embody power, one Sith to crave it. The master would teach, and the apprentice would learn. But the apprentice's role was not merely to follow. The apprentice was to challenge, to sharpen their strength against the masters. And when the apprentice grew strong enough, they would overthrow their master. Not through recklessness, not through impatience, but through calculated, undeniable strength. In this way, the Sith would become stronger with each generation, ensuring that only the most cunning, the most powerful, would survive. This was the essence of the Sith, not disorder, but a cycle of strength. The rule of two was not a betrayal of the Sith's history. It was a refinement. It was evolution. Bane saw what no Sith before him had understood. The dark side could not be wielded by many. It could only be mastered by those who were worthy. But Bane's revolution did not begin and end with philosophy. He needed an heir. He needed an apprentice who would carry this vision forward. He found her on Ruusan, among the wreckage of war. Zana was a child when Bane discovered her, but the Force had marked her as something more. She had survived the massacre on Ruusan not by chance, but through instinct. She had already begun to touch the dark side, though she did not yet understand it. Bane saw potential in her, a mind as sharp as his own, a will strong enough to endure the trials to come. He did not need an army. He needed one successor, trained in the new way of the Sith. Zana would be that successor. Together, they disappeared into the shadows. The galaxy believed the Sith were no more, and the Jedi, exhausted by war, did not question it. They had fought for so long that they welcomed peace without hesitation. They rebuilt, believing the darkness had been vanquished. But peace had made them blind. The Jedi had always been warriors of ideals, but war had changed them. They had become soldiers, generals, enforcers of the Republic's will. And now, without the Sith, they found themselves without purpose. For the first time in history, they were not fighting an enemy. They were maintaining an illusion. The Republic saw them as guardians of peace, but the Jedi themselves were uncertain of their role. They had won, but at what cost? And so, while the Jedi debated philosophy, while the Republic rebuilt from the devastation, Bane and Zana waited. They trained, they prepared. The Sith were not gone, they had only changed. This was the genius of the rule of two. The Sith would never again reveal themselves as a conquering force. They would never again fight the Jedi in open war. That path had always led to failure. Instead, they would move in the shadows, manipulating events from within. The Sith would work through deception, through patience. They would infiltrate the Republic, corrupt its foundation, weaken the Jedi not through war, but through slow decay. For 1,000 years the Sith had fought the Jedi through brute force, and for 1,000 years they had been defeated. Now they would fight another way. Bane had no interest in a single victory. His war would be fought over generations. The Sith would not seek to destroy the Jedi. They would seek to erode them, to make them vulnerable, to break their connection to the Force itself. And so, the greatest deception in galactic history began. The Jedi believed they had won, but the true war had only just begun. The Sith no longer needed armies. They no longer needed to rule openly. They had learned the greatest lesson of all. Power was not something taken. It was something built over time, with patience and cunning. Bane had given the Sith a future, and through Zana, that future would endure. The galaxy would forget the Sith. The Jedi would become complacent. And when the time was right, the Sith would return, not as conquerors, but as masters. The Mandalorians had always been warriors, but this war was different. This was not a conquest for glory, not a skirmish against scattered worlds. This was a campaign of destruction, a calculated assault against the Republic itself. The Mandalorians did not seek to rule, they sought to burn. Planets fell, entire systems collapsed under their brutality. The Republic begged the Jedi for aid, but the Jedi Council did nothing. The Jedi believed in balance, in the will of the Force. They had fought wars before, but this time they hesitated. War was a path to darkness. Violence, even in defense, left scars, and so they deliberated, debating the ethics of intervention while the Republic suffered. They saw the Mandalorian Wars as a test, one the Republic would have to pass without them. The Jedi Order was meant to be above politics, above war. They were keepers of peace, not generals. But not all Jedi agreed. Among them, two figures refused to stand aside. Revan and Malak, brilliant, charismatic, restless. They had seen the devastation firsthand, had walked among the ruins left in the wake of the Mandalorians. While the Council meditated, Revan took action. He gathered Jedi who shared his conviction, warriors who could not ignore suffering while they had the power to stop it. This was not rebellion, this was necessity. The Jedi Civil War did not begin as a war. It began as a choice. Revan's followers, called the Revanchists, left the Order behind, choosing war over philosophy. They did what the Jedi would not. They fought, and they won. But war has a cost. The Mandalorians were powerful, but they had never faced an opponent like Revan. He was not only a warrior, he was a tactician, a strategist, a mind that could see a battlefield not as a clash of armies, but as a puzzle to be solved. He understood the Mandalorians in ways the Jedi never had. He did not fight by the Jedi Code. He fought to win. It was on Malachor V that the war ended. The Mandalorians had gathered their full strength, expecting a final, honorable battle. But Revan had no interest in honor. He activated the Mass Shadow Generator, a super weapon that crushed fleets, obliterated armies, and left nothing but echoes in the Force. The Mandalorians were broken. The war was over. But something had changed. Revan had seen war in its rawest form. He had fought with power unrestrained, had wielded the Force without the limits imposed by the Jedi. And in doing so, he had found something the Jedi had never told him. The Force did not take sides. It was not light or dark. It was power, and power was meant to be used. Victory had not come without consequence. Revan and his followers had stared into the abyss, and they had not looked away. Returning from war, they did not return as Jedi. They returned as something else. The Republic celebrated them as heroes, but the Jedi knew the truth. Revan and Malak had been changed by what they had seen, by what they had done. Their actions had saved the Republic, but at what cost? The line between Jedi and Sith had never been so thin. And then, without warning, Revan and Malak disappeared. They had gone beyond known space, chasing whispers of something far greater than the Mandalorian threat. What they found changed the course of galactic history forever. They returned, but not as Jedi. They returned as Sith. The Mandalorian Wars had been a crucible, a forge that had tempered Revan into something the Jedi had feared. The Council had refused to intervene, believing war would only lead to darkness. In doing so, they had been proven right, but not in the way they had expected. By standing aside, they had forced a new generation of Jedi to choose their own path. And in that choice, the Jedi Order had fractured. The Jedi who had followed Revan had seen what war required. They had seen that the Jedi Code was not an answer, only a restriction. They had found the truth the Jedi refused to accept. Sometimes power was the only answer. The war was over. But the real battle had just begun. Revan had learned something the Jedi had ignored. There were threats in the galaxy far greater than the Mandalorians, far greater than the Sith the Jedi had known. There were shadows beyond the edges of the Republic, forces moving in the darkness, waiting. He had seen them, he had felt them, and he had realized that the Jedi were unprepared. The Mandalorian Wars had not created Revan, they had revealed him. And so, as the Republic rebuilt and the Jedi sought to reclaim their fallen, a new storm gathered. The Jedi had feared war would bring darkness. They had been right. But the darkness had not come from war. It had come from within. Revan had once been the Republic's greatest hero. Now he was its greatest threat. The Mandalorian Wars had changed him, forging him into something the Jedi had not foreseen. The man who had defied the Jedi Council, who had taken up the burden of war when the Order refused, had returned, not as a Jedi, but as a conqueror. He and Malak had ventured into the unknown regions and found something powerful enough to turn them against the very Order they once served. The Jedi Civil War was unlike any war before it. This was not the battle of light versus dark. This was light against light, a war fought between those who had once been brothers and sisters. The Jedi Order, already fractured by the Mandalorian Wars, now faced an even greater crisis. Their own had turned against them, leading a Sith empire built from Jedi who had followed Revan into exile. These were not Sith born of ancient teachings, but warriors who had seen the cost of inaction. They had been disillusioned by the Council's hesitation, by its refusal to act, by its belief that war itself was a path to darkness. But what if darkness had already come? What if the Jedi had only ensured their own destruction by doing nothing? Revan did not fight to destroy the Republic. He fought to claim it. He did not seek chaos. He sought order. He believed the Jedi were blind, that their philosophy of detachment and balance had left them weak. The Republic was vulnerable, divided, and he had seen firsthand what awaited beyond the stars. He did not wish to rule for the sake of power. He wished to prepare, and for that, he needed to break the Jedi. Malak, however, did not see the same future. He was not the tactician Revan was. He was not the philosopher. He saw only the power they had taken, the strength they had gained by breaking free from the Jedi Code. Where Revan sought to rebuild the Republic under his vision, Malak sought domination. He saw the Jedi as an obstacle to be destroyed, not as a lesson to be rewritten. And so, when Revan was struck down in battle, betrayed by Malak in an act of pure Sith ambition, the war changed. With Revan gone, Malak became the Dark Lord of the Sith. But he was not Revan. He was not the strategist. He was not the leader who could unite his followers with vision alone. Malak led with fear, and his war became a war of extermination. It was under Malak's rule that the Jedi Order faced its greatest slaughter. The Sith did not simply fight Jedi on battlefields. They hunted them. They tracked them to their enclaves, their hidden sanctuaries, and wiped them out. Malak's forces descended upon Dantooine, where the Jedi Enclave had long stood as a place of learning and refuge. There would be no refuge anymore. The Jedi were massacred, their holocrons shattered, their students and masters alike cut down without mercy. It was the same on Katar. There, the Sith did not simply kill the Jedi, they erased them. The Sith assassins, trained in the art of concealment, waited until the moment was right. Then, with a single devastating ritual, they consumed the Jedi gathered there. The Force itself screamed as an entire world was silenced. The Jedi were dying, and they did not understand why. The war had begun as a war of philosophy. Revan had fought to reshape the Jedi's role in the galaxy, to break the chains of their outdated doctrine. He had fought because he had seen something greater lurking in the unknown, something neither Jedi nor Republic were ready for. He had sought to prepare the galaxy for the battles to come, but Malak had turned it into something else. This was no longer a war to reshape the Jedi. This was a war to end them, and the Jedi were unprepared. The Council, already weakened, had no answer for the Sith's relentless advance. The Jedi had always fought wars against the Sith, but they had never fought against their own. They had never faced enemies who knew their tactics, who understood their philosophy, who could anticipate every move they made. Revan had trained his followers well, and even in his absence, their strength continued to grow. The Republic's fleets burned. Entire Jedi temples fell. In desperation, the Jedi did something they had never done before. They ran. They scattered, vanishing into the outer rim, severing their ties to the Force to hide themselves from the Sith. They abandoned their temples, their strongholds, their teachings. Those who could not disappear were slaughtered. The Jedi Civil War was not simply a battle between Jedi and Sith. It was an extinction. And yet, even in the war's final moments, the Jedi did not understand. Did Revan's war expose the flaws in Jedi philosophy? Or did it prove that the Sith were always destined to rise again? Revan had not set out to destroy the Jedi Order, but in forcing them to confront their own weaknesses, he had done something no Sith before him had accomplished. He had broken them, not just through battle, not just through war, but through an idea. Revan's war was a test, and the Jedi had failed. But history does not end with failure. The Jedi Order had been shattered, but it had not been erased. The war had burned away its illusions, had stripped it down to its very core. The Jedi had always believed themselves to be keepers of balance. But balance was not stagnation. It was not silence. It was not refusing to act while the galaxy burned. The Jedi Civil War had destroyed the Order, but it had also forced it to change. The war was over, but the lessons it left behind had only begun. The Jedi Order had endured wars before. It had faced the Sith, the Mandalorians, even its own civil conflicts. But the Dark Wars were something else entirely. This was not just a war, it was annihilation. The Jedi had been shattered by the Jedi Civil War, scattered to the farthest reaches of the galaxy, hiding in the shadows, severing their connection to the Force to avoid detection. And yet, even in exile, they could not escape what was coming. The Sith had returned. But they were not the Sith the Jedi had fought before. These were not warlords or conquerors, not the remnants of a broken empire. These Sith were something far worse, predators. They did not march armies across the stars. They did not seek to rule. They sought only to consume. At the center of this devastation stood Darth Nihilus, a being unlike any the galaxy had ever known. He was not a Sith Lord in the traditional sense. He did not command with words, nor did he need to. He was hunger incarnate, a void in the Force that devoured all life in his path. Planets fell to him, not through battle, but through his very presence. Whole worlds were stripped of life, leaving behind nothing but silence. The Jedi who had survived the war against Revan and Malak were already broken, but against Nihilus, they had no defense. To fight a Sith Lord was to battle strength with strength. To fight Nihilus was to fight against nothingness itself. Jedi Masters, survivors of the war, those who had spent years in hiding, finally stepped into the light to confront this new enemy. They did not return to fight a war. They returned to die. Each Jedi that stood against him was consumed. Each battle was over before it even began. Even those who severed themselves from the Force could not escape. Nihilus did not need to strike them down. He simply erased them from existence. The Jedi had never faced anything like him. But Nihilus was not alone. He was not the only Sith Lord to rise from the ashes of the Jedi Civil War. There was another, one who did not seek destruction, but corruption. Darth Sion was his name, and unlike Nihilus, he was no phantom of hunger. He was pain. Sion was unkillable, a Sith who had shattered his own body and bound himself together through sheer will. Every wound he suffered made him stronger. Every death he should have faced was simply another reason to fight harder. Where Nihilus devoured, Sion endured. And between them, the Jedi had no future. The Sith had won. Or had they? The Dark Wars were not a war in the traditional sense. There were no grand battles, no sieges, no fleets clashing in the void. The Republic still existed, struggling to rebuild in the wake of Revan's war. And yet, without the Jedi, it was defenseless. The Sith Lords of this era did not want to rule. They wanted to erase. But not all Jedi were lost. There were those who had survived, not by hiding, not by running, but by refusing to let go of what they were. Some sought out others, forming small enclaves, pockets of resistance against the Sith's relentless purge. Others became something different, abandoning the strict teachings of the old Jedi Code, seeking new ways to understand the Force. But they were too few. The Jedi had been dwindling for years, their numbers culled by war, by betrayal, by the slow decay of their own ideology. The galaxy had turned against them. The Republic had doubted them. And now, with Nihilus and Sion hunting them to the very last, there were those who wondered, did the Jedi deserve this fate? Was this simply the final cycle of a flawed order? Had the Jedi sealed their own doom with their blindness, their arrogance, their refusal to change? The answer did not matter. What mattered was survival. It was in the darkest moments of the Dark Wars that the Jedi found their most unlikely savior. Not a Grand Master, not a council of wise leaders, but an exile. A Jedi who had walked away from the Order years before, cast out for choosing war over pacifism, for defying the Council's will in the Mandalorian Wars. They called them the Jedi Exile, and in their return, the galaxy would change again. The Dark Wars had nearly wiped out the Jedi. The Sith had hunted them to the edge of extinction, and yet, even in this time of destruction, even in the depths of despair, the Jedi had not truly died. The Sith had believed that by destroying the Jedi, they would claim victory. But they had forgotten one simple truth. The Force does not fade, and neither do those who carry it. The Dark Wars were not the end of the Jedi. They were only the beginning of something new. The Jedi Order had always endured. Across centuries of war, betrayal, and ideological conflict, it had been battered but never broken. But after the Dark Wars, after the near-complete extinction of its members, the Order stood at a crossroads. It was no longer a question of rebuilding, it was a question of survival. Could the Jedi reclaim their place as guardians of peace, or had their time passed? The Dark Wars had exposed a fundamental weakness in the Jedi Code. The Order had fallen not only because of the Sith, but because of its own rigidity. The Jedi had failed to evolve, clinging to outdated doctrines while the galaxy moved forward. They had exiled those who sought change, dismissed those who questioned their authority, and ignored warnings until it was too late. Now, with so few of them left, they had no choice but to face a difficult truth. They could not rebuild the Order as it once was. They had to become something new. The question was, what did that mean? Some Jedi believed that the Order should abandon its close ties to the Republic. The Jedi had fought and died for the Republic for millennia, but where had it led them? Time and again, they had become soldiers in wars they did not start, tools of a political system that did not always have their best interests at heart. Was it wisdom to continue serving a government that could betray them? Or was it cowardice to walk away from their duty? There were those who believed the Jedi should return to their roots, not as generals, not as enforcers of the Republic's laws, but as wandering sages, teachers, and defenders of balance. They sought to distance themselves from Coruscant, to spread across the galaxy in small enclaves, guiding civilizations from the shadows rather than ruling from a council chamber. To them, the Jedi Order had been at its strongest when it was decentralized, when it answered only to the Force and not to a Senate. But others argued that without structure, without discipline, the Jedi would fracture again. The Dark Wars had shown what happened when the Order was divided. The Jedi Civil War had begun with well-intentioned warriors seeking to protect the Republic, only for them to become the very thing they had sworn to fight. Revan and Malak had been Jedi once. So had Exar Kun. What was to stop another from rising, from leading the Order down a darker path once more? And then there were the Jedi who had walked away entirely. Some had seen the fall of the Order and decided that the Jedi way was flawed beyond repair. They abandoned their titles, their robes, their sabers, and faded into the far reaches of the galaxy. Some lived in exile, refusing to take part in the Jedi's rebirth. Others became something else: warriors, philosophers, mercenaries, leaders of their own movements. Some even found themselves drawn to the teachings of the Sith, believing that the truth lay not in one side of the Force, but in its balance. For the Jedi who remained, the road ahead was unclear. The galaxy was still in chaos. The Sith had been driven back into the shadows, but they had not been destroyed. The Republic had barely survived the devastation of the wars, and its trust in the Jedi had been shaken. The people of the galaxy had seen the Jedi fall, had watched their temples burn, had heard whispers that the Jedi had brought this fate upon themselves. Would they welcome the Order's return, or fear that another war was inevitable? Even among the Jedi who sought to rebuild, there was debate over what it meant to be Jedi. Could they afford to hold themselves to the same rigid code that had led to their downfall? Could they still demand emotional detachment when it was often love and connection that had saved them? Could they still forbid attachments when it was their bonds with others that had given them the strength to endure? The scars of the past were not so easily erased. Many Jedi still struggled with the trauma of the wars, with the guilt of those they had failed to save, with the weight of an order that had all but collapsed under their watch. Some questioned if they were even worthy of rebuilding it. Others feared that in trying to restore what had been lost, they would only set the stage for another war. The Jedi Order had fallen before. It had been hunted to the brink of extinction more than once, and yet each time it had risen again. But was that truly a sign of strength? Or was it proof that the Jedi were trapped in a cycle they could never escape? The answer would not come easily. The Jedi Reformation was not a single moment, nor a single decision. It was a struggle, one that would last for generations. Some would embrace change, others would resist it. And the Sith, always waiting, always watching, would take advantage of every moment of weakness. For all their debate, for all their attempts to redefine themselves, one question remained unanswered. Did the Jedi ever truly recover? Or had the wars left scars too deep to heal? The Jedi were never meant to be soldiers. For thousands of years they had served as guardians of peace, wielding the Force not as a weapon of conquest, but as a guide to justice and wisdom. And yet, when war came to the Republic, when the galaxy fell into chaos, the Jedi did not hesitate. They took command of armies, donned the armor of warriors, and became generals in a conflict unlike anything they had ever faced. It was a decision that would change the Jedi forever. The Clone Wars was not just another galactic conflict. It was a test of the Jedi Order's very identity. The Republic's war against the Separatists was vast, spanning thousands of systems, fought by legions of clone soldiers engineered for battle. The Jedi, once peacekeepers, found themselves at the head of these armies, leading men who had been born to fight and die at their command. But could an order sworn to protect life justify becoming instruments of war? From the beginning, the war forced the Jedi into moral compromises. The Republic was crumbling, its corruption laid bare, yet the Jedi stood beside it, fighting to preserve a system that was already falling apart. Their enemy, the Separatists, was led by Count Dooku, a Sith Lord, but one who had once been a Jedi. His claim that the Republic was beyond saving, that the Jedi were puppets of a failing government, was not entirely untrue. And yet, the Jedi fought against him, not because they believed the Republic was pure, but because they saw no other choice. But was it a choice at all? The Clone Wars had not begun naturally. It had been engineered. The Sith had orchestrated every step, manipulating the Republic and the Jedi into a war they could never truly win. Darth Sidious, operating in the shadows, controlled both sides. He fueled the conflict with deception, ensuring that no matter who emerged victorious, the Jedi would be the ones who suffered most. The war changed the Jedi in ways they never anticipated. As generals, they had to make decisions that no Jedi should have been forced to make, ordering attacks, leading invasions, sacrificing soldiers for the sake of victory. The clones followed without question, but each Jedi who fought alongside them knew the truth. They were leading men who had never been given a choice. The clones were born into war, bred for battle, their identities erased before they could even form. And yet the Jedi fought beside them, knowing that their existence was a tragedy of its own. The burden of command weighed heavily on the Jedi. Many struggled to reconcile their role as warriors with their duty as peacekeepers. Some, like Anakin Skywalker, embraced the war, finding purpose in battle. Others, like Ahsoka Tano, questioned whether the Jedi should have been involved at all. And then, there were those who saw the war for what it truly was, a trap, a game being played by unseen forces. As the war dragged on, the Jedi lost themselves. Their temples remained, their traditions endured, but something fundamental had changed. They no longer mediated disputes between star systems. They conquered them. They no longer sought to prevent war. They fought to win it. They spoke of peace while waging battle, claiming to serve the Force while ignoring its warnings. And all the while, the Republic grew darker. The Senate became more authoritarian, granting Supreme Chancellor Palpatine greater powers with each passing crisis. The Jedi, sworn to defend democracy, watched as it eroded before their eyes, yet they did nothing. Their hands were too bloodied, their focus too consumed by war. They had become soldiers, and soldiers followed orders. Some Jedi began to see the truth too late. Master Pong Krell, once a respected Jedi, turned against his own clones, believing that the Republic was doomed and that the Jedi should align with the Sith instead. Barriss Offee, a Padawan trained in the Jedi ways, bombed the Jedi Temple in an act of rebellion, declaring that the Jedi had become no better than the Sith they claimed to oppose. Her actions were condemned, but her words rang true. Had the Jedi lost their way? Had they already fallen without even realizing it? By the end of the war, the Jedi Order was no longer what it had been. It still held its councils, still trained its Padawans, still preached the wisdom of the Force, but it had become something else. An army, an institution of war, a force that no longer knew how to exist without battle. And then, just as quickly as the war had begun, it ended. The Republic fell, the Jedi were declared traitors, and Order 66 was executed. In a single moment, the Jedi, once the leaders of the Republic's armies, became its greatest enemies. The clones they had fought beside, the men they had led into battle, turned their weapons against them without hesitation. It was not just a betrayal, it was the culmination of a war the Jedi had never truly understood. The Clone Wars had never been about victory. It had never been about protecting the Republic. It had always been a tool, a carefully constructed deception, designed to break the Jedi from within. And it had worked. When the war was over, the Jedi Order was gone. The temples were empty, the teachings forgotten, the survivors scattered across the stars. The Jedi had fought a war they could never win, and in doing so, they had destroyed themselves. The Jedi believed themselves untouchable, an order so deeply woven into the Republic that they could never truly fall. They had survived countless wars, endured betrayals, and faced the Sith time and again. But their greatest enemy was never the Sith. It was their own blindness. The Great Jedi Purge was not just a massacre, it was the final crushing consequence of their arrogance. Order 66 was not an attack, it was an execution. The Jedi, spread across the stars as generals of the Republic's armies, had placed their lives in the hands of the very soldiers they commanded. They fought alongside them, bled beside them, trusted them. And when the moment came, they never saw the betrayal until it was too late. The command came from Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, now revealed as Darth Sidious, the Sith Lord who had orchestrated the war from the beginning. With a single order, thousands of Jedi were marked for death. The clones, loyal and disciplined, obeyed without hesitation. These were not assassins driven by hatred, nor warriors seeking vengeance. They were soldiers, programmed to kill, carrying out a directive encoded into their very being. It happened everywhere, all at once. On the battlefields of countless worlds, Jedi were gunned down by the very men they had trusted. Some fought back, cutting through their former allies in a desperate attempt to escape. Others, too shocked to react, were slain before they could even ignite their sabers. Some tried to reason with the clones, pleading for understanding, only to be met with cold, unflinching obedience. On Coruscant, the heart of the Republic, the massacre was even more brutal. The Jedi Temple, the sacred heart of the Order, became a war zone. Darth Vader, once Anakin Skywalker the Chosen One, led the assault. The 501st Legion marched through the great halls, their blasters set to kill. Jedi Masters fought to defend the younglings, but it was futile. The temple, once a sanctuary of peace, became a tomb. And yet, the massacre was not enough. The Sith did not just want the Jedi dead, they wanted them erased. Records were destroyed, holocrons seized, history rewritten. The galaxy was told that the Jedi had betrayed the Republic, that they were traitors plotting against the people they had sworn to protect. Fear took root. Those who had once looked to the Jedi for guidance now turned away, unwilling to risk being associated with the Fallen Order. Some Jedi survived. A handful managed to escape the Purge, vanishing into exile. Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda, two of the greatest Jedi Masters, went into hiding, waiting for the right moment to strike back. Others, like Kanan Jarrus, buried their past, living as outcasts. Some, like Ahsoka Tano, had already walked away from the Jedi before the Purge, their fate forever altered by the Order's failures. But for every Jedi who escaped, dozens more were hunted down. The newly formed Empire had no tolerance for loose ends. The Inquisitorius, former Jedi turned hunters, was created to eliminate the survivors. These dark acolytes, trained by Vader himself, scoured the galaxy for any trace of the old order. Those who resisted were killed. Those who surrendered were broken and turned into weapons of the Empire. The Jedi were gone. Their temples were empty ruins, their teachings outlawed. The Sith had won, or so it seemed. For even in their darkest hour, the Jedi endured. The Force, ever in motion, refused to let their legacy die. The survivors carried the last embers of the Order, waiting for the moment when the galaxy would need them again. The Sith, in their arrogance, believed they had destroyed the Jedi. In truth, they had only set the stage for their return. The Jedi Order was gone, its temples reduced to ruins, its teachings outlawed, and its members hunted to the brink of extinction. The Great Purge had wiped away thousands of years of tradition in mere days, but not every Jedi fell to Order 66. Some survived, not as warriors or protectors, but as fugitives, ghosts of a forgotten age, scattered across the galaxy. They lived in exile, constantly looking over their shoulders, knowing the Sith's reach was vast, and their hunters relentless. But was survival truly victory? Some Jedi had abandoned the Order long before the Clone Wars, disillusioned with its rigid dogma. These outcasts had walked away from the Jedi way, and by sheer luck or foresight, had escaped the slaughter. Were they the fortunate ones? Had they seen the flaws within the Order long before its downfall? Ahsoka Tano, once Anakin Skywalker's Padawan, had turned her back on the Council after being falsely accused of treason. Her departure had spared her life, but at a terrible cost. She watched the Order collapse from the outside, unable to save it. Yet even without the Jedi name, she still fought against the Sith's tyranny. Did that make her more of a Jedi than those who had remained loyal to the end? Then there were the true survivors, the Jedi who had been caught in the Purge but had managed to escape. Some lived in the shadows, hiding their Force abilities, suppressing who they were to avoid detection. Obi-Wan Kenobi buried himself on Tatooine, watching over Luke Skywalker from a distance, his once great power reduced to quiet solitude. Yoda, the wisest of the Jedi, retreated to Dagobah, seeking refuge in a place strong in the Force, where he could remain unseen by the Sith. These were not victories, but resignations. They lived not for themselves, but for the hope that one day someone would rise to continue the Jedi legacy. Not all survivors remained in hiding. Some tried to rebuild, forming secret enclaves, seeking out others like them. But the Sith knew this would happen. The Empire's Jedi hunters, the Inquisitors, were created for this very purpose. Once Jedi themselves, these dark enforcers had been twisted by the Sith, their minds broken, their loyalty redirected. They knew how Jedi thought, how they fought, how they hid. Their mission was not just to kill, but to hunt, to root out the last remnants of the Order before they could become a threat. Every time a Jedi revealed themselves, whether by an act of defiance or a moment of desperation, the Inquisitors were there. Kanan Jarrus, once a Padawan named Caleb Doom, had survived by rejecting the Jedi way, suppressing his connection to the Force. But when he used his abilities to save another, he was discovered. He spent the rest of his life on the run, fighting to protect the next generation, knowing the enemy would never stop hunting him. Some survivors lost faith. The fall of the Order shattered their belief in the Jedi Code, in the Force itself. Others, like Quinlan Vos, fell into darkness, unable to reconcile their failure with the path they had once walked. Did these fallen Jedi betray their own, or did they simply see the truth? That the Jedi's time had ended, that they had been fighting an unwinnable war for centuries. And yet, despite everything, the Jedi endured. The Sith had won, but they had not erased the Jedi. The survivors carried their legacy forward, even if they no longer called themselves Jedi. They trained in secret, passed on their knowledge, and waited for the moment when the galaxy would need them again. They were scattered, broken, and diminished, but they were not gone. Could they have saved the galaxy? Some might argue that if the Jedi had fought back sooner, united against the Empire's rise, they could have turned the tide. But against an enemy as powerful as Darth Sidious, as relentless as Darth Vader, what chance did they truly have? Survival was not cowardice. It was patience. It was waiting for the right moment, for the right people, for the Force itself to guide the next steps. The Sith had their revenge, but the Jedi were never truly lost. They had merely become something else, something unseen. And in the shadows, they waited. The Jedi were thought to be extinct, their temples burned, their legacy shattered, and their teachings forgotten. But in the darkest time of the galaxy, when the Sith's grip was absolute, the Force still moved unseen. The Jedi were not gone. They had simply become ghosts. Some had chosen exile, waiting for the right moment to rise again. Others lived in secrecy, preserving fragments of the old knowledge in whispers and forgotten places. Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda, two of the greatest Jedi Masters, did not fight back against the Empire, not at first. They could have led an underground war, rallying the scattered survivors, striking at the Sith from the shadows. But they chose patience. They saw what the Sith had become, more powerful than ever, ruling with an iron fist. To fight blindly would have been to waste what little remained of the Jedi. Instead, they waited, not for their own victory, but for the one who would bring balance to the Force. Was Luke Skywalker truly the last hope? It is easy to believe so, but the truth was more complicated. Luke was the one meant to confront Darth Vader, to fulfill a destiny written long before his birth. But he was not the only one carrying the Jedi's legacy. Others fought in secret, hidden from history, ensuring that the Order would not die with them. Ahsoka Tano, who had walked away from the Jedi, still lived by their ideals, fighting against the Empire without their name. Kanan Jarrus, a survivor of the Purge, trained a new apprentice in the ways of the Force, knowing that one day the Jedi would be needed again. The Rebel Alliance was more than just a political movement. It was a battle for the very soul of the galaxy. And though the Jedi no longer stood on the front lines as generals, their influence was felt in every act of defiance. The rebellion itself was an echo of the Jedi's old mission, to protect the innocent, to stand against tyranny, to believe in something greater than power. The Jedi Order may have been destroyed, but its teachings endured, even among those who had never held a lightsaber. Did the Jedi truly survive in secret? The Empire hunted relentlessly, erasing every trace of their existence. Holocrons, sacred texts, and ancient knowledge were either destroyed or hidden away. Yet some remained, passed between trusted hands, waiting for the right moment to be used again. There were still those who could feel the Force, who longed for guidance, even if they did not know the words to describe it. The Jedi had always been more than an order. They were a philosophy, an idea, and ideas cannot be killed. Obi-Wan and Yoda's decision to wait was not made lightly. They knew the risks, knew that by staying in hiding, they were allowing the Sith to grow stronger. But they also knew that to act too soon would doom any chance of true restoration. They had seen what happened when the Jedi fought without understanding, how they had been manipulated, turned into weapons, and led to their own destruction. They would not make the same mistake again, and so they waited, trusting in the Force, believing that when the time was right, a new Jedi would rise. Luke Skywalker did not come to them as a warrior, but as a student. He was not trained to fight a war, but to understand the truth, to see beyond the conflict, beyond the cycle of violence that had defined Jedi and Sith for millennia. He was not meant to be just another Jedi. He was meant to be something different. The war against the Empire was fought in the open, starships clashing, armies rising, worlds burning. But beneath it, another war was being waged. A battle of knowledge, of belief, of what it truly meant to follow the Force. The Jedi had fallen because they had lost their way, because they had become too rigid, too blinded by their own teachings. If they were to return, they could not simply repeat the past. As Luke trained, as the rebellion grew, as the Sith tightened their grip, a question lingered. Was the old way of the Jedi worth saving, or was it time for something new? The Force had not abandoned the galaxy. It was waiting, just as the Jedi were. And soon, the last remnants of the Order would have to decide, not just how to fight, but how to rebuild. The Battle of Endor was more than a clash between fleets, more than the destruction of the second Death Star. It was the culmination of a war that had raged for millennia, the final confrontation between Jedi and Sith, between light and darkness. But was it truly an ending, or merely another turn in an unbroken cycle? At the heart of the battle was Luke Skywalker, the last Jedi, standing before Darth Vader and Emperor Palpatine. He was not a warrior like the Jedi of old. He had not been trained for war. And yet, he was the first Jedi in generations to truly understand what the Order had forgotten, that victory was not found in destruction, but in redemption. Luke and Vader's duel was not just a contest of strength, but of belief. Vader had been trapped in servitude for decades, bound to the will of the Emperor, his identity buried beneath the Sith's doctrine. And yet there was something in Luke's presence, in his defiance, that made him hesitate. Unlike the Jedi who had come before, Luke did not seek to kill him. He did not seek to destroy the Sith, only to save his father. And in that moment, something shifted. When Luke cast aside his weapon, refusing to fight any longer, he broke the very foundation of the Sith. The rule of two had always ensured that one Sith would rise and another would fall. But here was something different, an act of defiance not through violence but through choice. The Emperor's power lay in manipulation, in anger, in feeding hatred until there was nothing left. But Luke gave Vader another path, and for the first time in decades, Anakin Skywalker awoke. Palpatine's death marked the fall of the Empire, but did it truly mark the end of the war between Jedi and Sith? If the Sith were gone, If balance had been restored, why did darkness still remain in the galaxy? The Force had always been cyclical, its balance fragile, its will unknowable. Had Luke's victory broken the cycle, or had he simply reset it once more? The prophecy had spoken of one who would bring balance to the Force. Many believed that Anakin had failed, that his fall had doomed the Jedi and allowed darkness to reign. But what if the fall was necessary? What if Anakin's path had always led to this moment, to a final choice, to a final redemption? If so, then balance was never about destruction. It was about understanding. It was about breaking free from the old ways, from the endless war between light and dark. And yet, history has shown that endings are rarely so simple. The Sith had been thought extinct before, only to return in secrecy, waiting for their moment. The Jedi had been nearly wiped out, only to rise again from the ashes. The Force itself had not ended its work. The war had not ended, it had only transformed. The Battle of Endor was not the last Jedi War. It was the beginning of something new. With the Empire fallen and the Sith seemingly destroyed, the Jedi should have been able to reclaim their place in the galaxy. But for Luke Skywalker, the question was never about rebuilding the Jedi as they once were. It was about whether the Jedi should return at all. The old ways had failed. The Jedi had been guardians of peace, yet they had become warriors. They had sought wisdom, yet they had been blind to the Sith's rise. They had followed the will of the Force, yet they had been wiped out with the wave of a single command. Luke was not raised in the halls of the Jedi Temple. He had not spent his life studying the ancient texts or learning from the great masters. He had seen the Jedi only as legends, distant and unknowable. And when he finally stood among them, Obi-Wan, Yoda, and even the redeemed Anakin, he was left with more questions than answers. What was the Jedi's purpose? Had they ever truly understood the Force, or had they simply followed rules passed down without question? As he sought to rebuild, Luke struggled with these questions. He gathered students, training them in the ways of the Force. But he did not build another Jedi temple in the heart of the Republic. He did not swear allegiance to any government. The Jedi had once served the Republic, only to be used as weapons in its wars. Luke would not allow history to repeat itself. But teaching a new generation was not as simple as passing on techniques. The old Jedi Order had strict rules, no attachments, no emotion, no personal desires. They had believed that these restrictions kept them from the dark side. But was that true? Anakin had been raised in a system that denied love, that told him to reject his emotions. And in the end, that repression had not saved him. It had shattered him. Luke wanted to do things differently. He did not forbid attachment. He did not demand absolute obedience. He believed that the Force was not something to be controlled, but something to be understood. But understanding was not easy. The darkness had not disappeared with the fall of Palpatine. It had only retreated, waiting, as it always had. Luke's greatest failure came in the form of his own nephew, Ben Solo. The darkness that had once corrupted Anakin found its way into the next generation, slipping through the cracks of Luke's teachings. When he sensed the growing power within Ben, the shadow of the dark side, fear took hold. In a single moment of doubt, Luke considered striking his nephew down, an impulse that lasted only an instant. But an instant was all it took. Ben awoke to find his uncle standing over him, lightsaber ignited. It did not matter that Luke had stopped himself, that he had realized his mistake too late. Ben saw only betrayal, saw only the hypocrisy that had plagued the Jedi for generations. And in that moment, Luke's new order crumbled. In exile, Luke questioned everything. Had he failed because the Jedi were never meant to return? had the Force itself guided him toward destruction. The old Jedi Order had been rigid, blind to its own flaws, and yet Luke's attempt to do things differently had still led to tragedy. The Sith had always believed that the Jedi were doomed to fall because they denied reality, that they fought against the natural balance of the Force. Had they been right all along? But the Force does not end with one person. Luke may have lost faith in the Jedi, but the Force continued to move, to search for balance. Rey's arrival on Ahch-To was not chance. The Force had called her there, just as it had once called Luke to Dagobah, just as it had once guided Anakin to his destiny. And in her, Luke saw something unexpected, not the last of the Jedi, but the possibility of something new. In the end, Luke understood what the Jedi had always failed to see. The Jedi were not meant to be an institution, a set of rules to be followed without question. They were not meant to serve governments, to be warriors in wars. The Force did not belong to them. The Force had always been something greater. And so Luke did what no Jedi before him had ever done. He let go. He did not seek to return the Jedi to power. He did not seek to shape Rey into a perfect reflection of the past. He simply passed on what he had learned, not as law, but as wisdom. The future would not be his to control. It never had been. The Jedi would rise again, but they would not be what they once were. The past had been broken. The future was unwritten. And perhaps, for the first time in history, that was how it was meant to be. The Jedi have always seen themselves as guardians of peace, but history tells a different story, one of endless war, not just against the Sith, but among themselves. The Jedi have fought over doctrine, over interpretations of the Force, and over their own role in the galaxy. From the 100-year darkness to the Jedi Civil War, from Revan's betrayal to the Clone Wars, the cycle has remained unbroken. Each time, the Jedi sought to move beyond conflict, only to fall back into it. Darth Bane saw this pattern, not as a failure of the Sith, but as a flaw inherent in the Jedi themselves. He believed that power must be controlled, that conflict was necessary to forge strength. But in reshaping the Sith, did he also reshape the Jedi? The old Jedi Order feared attachment, believing that strong emotions led to the dark side. But was this fear their own, or did it stem from the Sith's influence over millennia of war? Did the Jedi, in their attempt to resist the dark side, create their own form of repression? Even among those who sought peace, darkness found a way in. The Jedi of the Clone Wars became warriors, commanders of armies, using the Force not for balance, but for battle. They justified it in the name of the Republic, but did that make them any different from the Sith Lords who sought to control the galaxy? Power, whether through violence or through ideology, always had a price. Can the Jedi ever be free of their history? They have spent centuries trying to separate themselves from the dark side, yet they have never escaped it. The more they fight against it, the more it shapes them. The cycle of light and dark is not about Jedi and Sith alone. It is about belief, about the way power moves through history. Until the Jedi truly understand this, they will remain trapped, forever repeating the past. The Jedi always claimed to be defenders of peace, yet their legacy is one of war. Across generations, they waged battles in the name of justice, believing each conflict to be the final one, the one that would bring lasting harmony. But peace never came. Instead, each war only set the stage for the next. The Sith rose and fell, yet the Jedi still found themselves locked in battle, even when the Sith were nowhere to be found. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the Jedi Wars was not about victory or defeat, but about the nature of struggle itself. The Jedi sought balance, yet they were always part of a larger cycle, one that could not be broken through war. Was the Force teaching them something they refused to see? That balance was not the absence of conflict, but the understanding of it. Throughout history, the Jedi defined their purpose through opposition. They fought the Sith, the Mandalorians, and even their own brethren, convinced they were on the right side of history. But what if war was never the path to understanding the Force? What if their constant need to fight was the very thing preventing them from truly achieving balance? Every battle they won only led to another, and the more they resisted the darkness, the more it found ways to return. The Jedi Wars were never truly about good versus evil. They were about belief, about the dangers of rigid philosophy and the cost of absolute conviction. Those who strayed from the Jedi Code were cast out, yet time and time again, it was these outcasts who reshaped the destiny of the galaxy. Revan, Qui-Gon Jinn, Luke Skywalker, all of them defied tradition, and in doing so came closer to understanding the Force than those who clung to dogma. In the end, the greatest truth of the Jedi Wars is that they were never truly over. The struggle between light and dark did not end with a battle, nor could it be resolved through victory. It was a lesson that could only be understood through failure, through the acceptance that balance is not something to be enforced. It is something to be lived.